So episode 2 of The Last of Us is out. Huge. I still can't believe that the show is actually happening right now. It just feels like it is. It was so long in development. Now we finally have it. And I'm so excited every week to sit down and press play. Before we get talking about episode 2, please consider subscribing. I'm going to try and do these every single week. Because Last of Us is my favorite game of all time. And so having this opportunity to talk about the show week by week is just something that I don't want to take for granted, and I really want to, delve into it and really break down each episode as it comes out, because it means so much to me, and it does to so many other people as well. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's start talking about episode 2 of The Last of Us. Also, you can like this video if that's your kind of thing. It helps me out, so please do. So this episode opens in Indonesia, which is really cool, something we haven't seen in the game, and we start to see a bit more about how the virus started. We see one of the very first patients, one of the very first people to have been infected, and what this scene sort of sets up is the stakes, the gravity of how these infected spread and how deadly they are and how easily they spread. And this episode is titled Infected for a reason. It is all about setting up the lore of the infected in the TV show. I like most of the new lore with the infected. I like the little fungus things that go around. Getting rid of spores, as much as I loved spores, I do really like this alternate version. I don't think one's necessarily better than the other. Maybe this version translates a little bit better on screen than just going through spores does. Especially because the game is so much about walking through locations, and here it's a lot more about sitting down and chatting, so there's less chances to sort of walk through spores. You're not going to have Joel and Ellie sit down with their masks on and having a chat whilst they're surrounded by spores. So I guess this version of the infected is a great way of, getting around that. But there is some things about these infected that I don't quite like. I'm going to get into them a little bit later in the video. So after the amazing title sequence, we have Joel, Ellie, and Tess addressing the bite, and we get to see their performances all on show here. I really realized how good Pedro Pascal is as Joel, because I loved him in the first episode, and there were so many times where I was like, yep, that's Joel, he's got that right. But this episode, even more so, I was like, man, this isn't just Pedro Pascal, trying to be like Troy Baker, trying to be Joel. This is Pedro Pascal just literally embodying Joel. The way that he doesn't look at Ellie in certain scenes, and the accent he has, so perfect. I think that's really great. I think the performances in these opening scenes were really good. Addressing the bite, I felt probably should have been at the end of the first episode, and maybe the conclusion of that first episode is them deciding that they're gonna take Ellie from A to B. Bella Ramsey throughout this episode is mostly really good. I'm still not 100% convinced. There's some scenes that I feel like she is mumbling or she's rushing through some of the dialogue, which I know Ellie does talk fast, but there's times where I feel like I can't quite understand what Bella Ramsey is saying. I don't know if that's just me. Sometimes I don't hear too well, so maybe it is to do with that. But yeah, there is some scenes where I'm actually like, what? Sorry, I need to put on the subtitles. I don't know what she said, but she is nailing it in some of those really important scenes that really do matter. There's times where I look at her facial expressions and I'm like, that's Ellie. That's Ellie. And she doesn't need to be exactly Ellie from the game, and I think that's what Bella Ramsey is doing. I think there's times where I need to get used to that. Maybe it's a me problem. Maybe Bella Ramsey's perfect and it's a me problem. And shout out to the highlight of this episode, Mr. Piano Frog, who is so good at playing piano that he scares himself. So as the scene continued and our characters start to make their way through the hotel, which is a fantastic showcase of how good the production design is in this show, I did start to get this lukewarm feeling where I was like, okay, this is taking a slightly different route than the game, which I was always open to. But for me, I've always been so keen on the sequence going through the slanted towers, just because that sequence in the game is terrifying. You've just gone through so much Fedra, which was all epic, which you also didn't get in the TV show. And then it's like you're out of the frying pan into the fire. You're now taking on infected, and it's a terrifying introduction. Having that sequence set in the rain at night was always terrifying to me. And so at this point in this episode, I started to sort of realize, okay, that's not what we're getting. And it's hard to shake that, because you have to shake it, because you can't expect everything to follow the same route as the game. But as a big fan of the game, especially a big fan of certain sequences in the game, you can't help but be disheartened and a little bit disappointed when certain things do get skipped. Now, I'm not going to let that detract from my score, because trust me, the more I accept the changes and the more I sort of think about them and process them, the more I enjoy the changes that they've made. And it's hard. You really have to understand that TV shows work so different to games in the way that they storytell. The way that they feed the audience information is so much different. You know, in the Last of Us podcast, Neil Druckmann's talking about how in the game, you have to have the whole sequence with Richard at the start of what would have been episode 1, because you are teaching so much conflict. You have to get the game player to get used to shooting and things like that. Whereas in the TV show, you're not teaching that information. It's a whole different ball game, and so you don't need as much of that conflict. So you do end up skipping things. On the topic of changes from the game, we do start to learn more about the infected. Like I said, it all plays out slightly different than it does in the game. We learned that, you know, you could stand on a piece of fungus or a hand somewhere in the city, and then it could wake up a whole line, you know, a whole like mile-long line of infected that could come charging at you. I love that. I think that's a great like hive mind thing. I think they kind of reference that sort of thing a little bit in the game from memory, but it's never specifically something they utilize. And in this episode of the TV show, they really are handing it home, and I love that change. But there is a change that I'm not as fond on. It's a minor thing, but when we're first introduced to the infected in this episode, we see them all sort of rolling around like babies in a crib, sort of, you know, just whining, not able to get up. And I don't know, it just felt like I'm not intimidated by these guys, especially like the angle they're looking down on them, which doesn't present them as an intimidating figure. In the game, you know, you see like silhouettes of them in corners of the room, like with their hands on their heads, and yes, they're whimpering, but they're still intimidating. They're so scary to see. I feel like, you know, just seeing a big horde of, you know, crying babies on the floor is nowhere near as intimidating as the infected that we see in the game. In the game, there's a constant threat of the infected, and you never really know when one might jump out at you or something like that. And I just felt like that wasn't necessarily encapsulated in this episode. However, we do get our first conflict with the infected, specifically with, I think, 2 clickers, and that sequence instantly hooked me back in. That lukewarm feeling really did sort of slowly go away during this scene, and my heart genuinely started to beat. You know, Joel trying to desperately reload the revolver, missing shots. I feel you, brother. I've been there. It's all quite frantic, and the sequence where, you know, you see the clicker behind Joel and you hear it clicking far away, and then all of a sudden you hear it click loud and close, and you see the look on Joel's face, and he's like, oh, that's not great. I love that. I love little things like, you know, him pushing over the statue to make a sound. It's the equivalent of throwing the bottle, but you know, it's a little bit more practical. So yeah, I thought that this sequence was probably my favorite sequence in the episode. I thought that was handled really, really well. The introduction of the infected was really good, and I think conveyed enough information of the clickers to the audience without sort of spelling it out and giving too much exposition. Anyways, Tess comes back and something clearly ain't right. So yeah, more beautiful production design in the museum, and then we also get to see the sequence of everyone crossing the plank, specifically Ellie crossing the plank. That's such a, you know, a visceral image that I always picture when I think of the game. And so being able to witness that scene and being faithful for that scene, I was very thankful that Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann decided to keep that in. On that note, this episode is, I think, co-written by Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin, and is directed for the first time by Neil Druckmann. And I think Neil Druckmann did a fantastic job. There is sequences that do just get your heart pumping. There's beautiful wides, amazing close-ups, and all sorts of great camera movements in there. There was a little bit of reliance on CGI for some of the bigger landscapes I don't think quite worked, but the nature of the game, yeah, it's implied that that's going to happen. I do just wish that some of the VFX were a little bit more tidied up. So in line with the game, when our characters do reach the Capitol building, you find out that all the Fireflies are dead, and that makes Tess angry because Tess has been bit. Whoa! That, I felt the gravity of it. Like, you feel that gravity in the game, but in the TV show, I really, really felt the gravity of it. Maybe it's knowing everything that we know about the game, having played it a few times, but you can just really feel the importance to Tess that Ellie needs to get to the Fireflies, because she's about to die and she doesn't want her death not to matter. And in those final moments in the Capitol building, it is gripping as the hordes of infected are coming in. You see her clicking what is that called? A lighter. You can tell I don't smoke. She flicks a lighter, and you're genuinely like, oh my god, is Tessa's death not going to matter? Which I think would have been heartbreaking and really good. But it is a great payoff to see her finally hit that lighter and blow everything to holy heck. Speaking of payoffs, that horde of infected, I think, did pay off some of the lore and the world building that they were building up throughout the episode. You know, we get to see someone flinch, and how that activates a whole bunch of infected, and how all the clickers and stuff come running in. We also see a weird and uncomfortable sequence where one of them makes out with Tess, you know, getting their little things into Tess's mouth, which was just confronting and weird, and it made you go, ugh. And I liked it. I'm not saying I love to see making out with infected people, but it felt weird and uncomfortable, and I enjoyed that. Once again, there is a lack of Fedra presence here, because in the game, instead of the infected coming in and killing Tess, it's Fedra troops that all rock up, and they, you know, it's another big action conflict where we're avoiding the Fedra people, that kind of thing. And this TV show, once again, they didn't have any of that Fedra presence here. And I think that's probably a good thing in this situation, because there is so much human conflict that is really important to the story later in the series. And I feel like if we start recycling, you know, techniques, and we start to recycle Joel fighting humans and Ellie fighting humans and then working together to fight humans, I feel like then it will become a little bit dry and a little bit overdone later in the show. So having this be sort of an infected focus episode, I think was probably the right decision. Like I said, the storytelling of TV shows work different to games. You can't just have masses of the same type of conflict in TV shows as you can get away with in games. And once again, we have a standout performance from Pedro and a standout performance from Bella. Bella killed it in these final moments. I thought she did an incredible job, and you can see a contrast between the two characters, with Ellie being someone who's clearly grieving after Tessa's death, and with Joel, you see when he just turns away from Tess and grabs Ellie and runs out of the building. You can see this is a broken man, a man who refuses to feel emotion again. He refuses to feel that pain after the death of his daughter in the previous episode. The characterization is all perfect here for me. You see the conflict and the contrast in the two characters, and I can't wait to watch them grow together. You know, that's what the show is going to be all about, watching these two characters grow, and I can't wait to see it. After a pretty faithful first episode, episode 2, Infected, really does rip the band-aid off and go, this isn't the same as the game. We are doing things different here. You're gonna miss scenes, but the heart and the most important things of the game are there, and that's what matters. And I think the more you come to terms with and accept the changes that they make, the more you realize that they were made for a reason. You know, Neil Druckmann obviously loves the game that he created, and Craig Mazin wanted to make this show because he loved the game so much. I think he said he's played the first game over 20 times. Anyways, this is a double thumbs up once again from Aiden. Probably not quite as good as the first episode here, because it's just a slower episode, not as much happens, but you get introduced to a whole lot more stuff, and you need that breathing room for a new audience to accept and interpret all that new information. Thank you very much for watching. Like I said, make sure you like this video and subscribe. I am gonna try and do this every week. I'll be very proud of myself if I do this every week. So yeah, please, you know, give me the motivation. Give me some love, I guess. Am I asking for love? That sounds weird. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed The Last of Us as much as I did. I'm curious to know what people think of the changes that are being made. So let me know your thoughts, and, you know, the contrast between some of the lore in the game and some of the sequences in the game and how they differ from the TV show. And let me know what you guys think of all that stuff. So write that stuff down in the comments below. My name's Aiden, and I'll see you next week. Bum, 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 bum.